A sleeping seer singled out 2026 as a hinge year, and now some say those warnings are lining up with a figure in the headlines: Donald Trump. That sentence lands like a stone thrown into still water. The ripples it makes depend on how close you stand to the shore. Before you lean in or turn away, hear this. What follows is an inquiry, not a verdict. It is a walk through documents, memories, modern events, and contested readings. It is an attempt to weigh an old prophet's language against the clamor of our present moment. And it asks one simple, urgent question. If Edgar Cayce did indicate a decisive turning point around 2026, what does that mean for a nation and a world already trembling? Edgar Cayce's name carries a peculiar weight. To his admirers, he was the sleeping prophet, a man who sank into a trance and spoke of healing, karma, Atlantis, and geopolitical upheaval with an assurance that baffled and fascinated his contemporaries. To skeptics, his readings are a mixtape of the era's anxieties and personal suggestion, a curious artifact rather than a map of future truth. The factual bones are straightforward. Born in 1877, Cayce worked in the early 20th century, offering thousands of short trance readings recorded by attendants and later archived. Many of these readings touched on health. Many others ventured into history and prophetic vision. His papers are housed with the Association for Research and Enlightenment, and scholars, devotees, and critics have pored over them for decades. Complicating any neat summary, however, is what people today call the forbidden letters, or private files, documents and transcriptions that sit at the margins of Cayce's publicly catalogued readings. Some researchers point to these materials as more alarming, more pointed than the available vetted readings. Others warn against trusting them. Provenance is debated, and among the archives and transcriptions you'll find a bewildering array of spellings and names. The seer's own name rendered incorrectly in some notes, and other clerical errors that can make an investigation feel at times like piecing together an old damp map. The files we can inspect include genuine Cayce readings, email and typewritten copies of private correspondence, and later commentaries that fold in interpretation. Scholars remind us that errors creep into any long archival trail. The presence of variant spellings of Cayce's name in secondary transcripts is a red flag to approach with caution. Yet for many believers, these disputed letters only deepen the sense of urgency. Here is a voice from the past that saw a particular pressure building toward a not-distant year. What exactly did Cayce say that points toward a pivot around 2026, summarizing the more relevant readings and the way commentators frame them? Cayce, in readings dated and interpreted by followers, spoke of a period of centuries' worth of slow change accelerating into a cataclysmic window near the middle of the 21st century. He used images of earth shakings, of coasts redrawn, and of magnetic disturbances. He suggested that nations once secure would be weakened while others rise, and he warned of moral corrosion within societies that would make politics more dangerous and leaders more consequential. Importantly, Cayce's overall tone in these passages was double-sided. He warned of judgment and upheaval, but he also insisted that spiritual awakening and reconstruction are possible if people choose repentance and service. Those familiar with Cayce's corpus will recognize the motifs, the shifting of poles or magnetic centers, seismic activity that affects the coasts of the United States, tremors in far-off places like Japan, and a time when established balances of power are strained. In specific readings referenced by commentators, California and New York are sometimes named as places that will feel the impact, and the language points to a reconfiguration of economic and political influence. Alongside natural imagery, Cayce's voice paints a portrait of leadership that can be charismatic and persuasive, yet ultimately divisive, a leader who appears to offer unity and restoration, but whose influence accelerates fracture. Those who read Cayce as prophetic see in this both a warning and a test. The crisis is not merely physical, it is moral and communal. Now step back for a moment from the voice of Cayce and look at the contemporary noise people point to when they say, "This is coming true." First, scientists have documented that the magnetic North Pole has been moving, and in recent decades, the pace of that movement attracted real scientific notice. Geophysicists study the wandering of the geomagnetic poles because it matters for navigation and for understanding Earth's interior dynamics. Scientists report that the North Magnetic Pole has drifted faster than it had in earlier centuries, and some models show potential impacts on satellites and navigation systems if shifts continue. That language, scientists report, models suggest, matters. It is not prophecy. It is data with uncertainty, and it is exactly the sort of phenomenon that interpreters of Cayce's readings point to as a tangible contemporary echo of his talk about poles and compass points. Second, extreme weather events, the fires that devour forests, the storms that seem to grow more frequent and intense, the floods that remake shorelines, have become part of daily news cycles. Climate scientists emphasize that human-driven warming has increased the intensity and probability of certain categories of extreme weather. Commentators who connect Cayce to the present find in these trends a plausible match for the seer's references to shakings of the earth and to dramatic changes on coastlines. Again, the careful phrasing is vital. Scientists describe trends and probabilities. Interpreters describe meaning. Third, seismic activity remains a living threat in certain regions. Japan's history of earthquakes, the fault lines that underlie California's anxiety, and the broader unpredictability of tectonic systems are all facts we can point to. Whether they cohere into a prophetic pattern is a question of hermeneutics, not geology. Those who find resonance between Cayce's imagery and the contemporary world tend to read such natural phenomena not as isolated facts, but as symptoms of a larger realignment. Finally, on the political side, the last decade has seen an intensification of domestic polarization in several democracies, especially the United States. Political discourse has hardened. Media ecosystems fragment attention. Economic anxieties and cultural shifts make for volatile coalitions. Some analysts describe this as a crisis of civic norms, others as a cycle of political realignment. Where Cayce spoke of a leader who claims unity but deepens division, commentators now map that phrase onto figures who rose in an age of fractured consensus. It is here that the title of this investigation, which places Cayce's prediction and Donald Trump together, enters its most sensitive territory. We must be emphatically clear. In the publicly catalogued Cayce readings available through established archives, no known entry explicitly names Donald Trump. The tie that links Cayce to any contemporary politician is interpretive. When modern commentators say Cayce predicted a leader like Trump, they are offering a reading. They match traits and timing from Cayce's language to characteristics they observe in a 20th first century leader. That interpretive move requires several steps: extracting symbolic descriptions from century-old trance language, translating those descriptions into modern political terms, and then mapping them onto a living, complicated individual whose public life was not written in the pages of a 1920s trance. That is a leap, sometimes a large leap, and it must be marked as such. So why do some researchers and internet commentators press that leap anyway? There are patterns that feel intuitive to many observers. Consider the life cycle of a modern political figure who commands attention through spectacle and media. They explode onto the scene, harness grievance, present themselves as an outsider who alone can correct a national decline, and then create a loyalty dynamic that reorients institutions and norms. In times of stress, economic strain, cultural anxiety, environmental threat, such leaders can acquire outsized influence because people seek certainty in chaos. Cayce's phrasing about a leader who professes unity while deepening cleavages reads, in our contemporary idiom, as the portrait of someone who governs through division as much as through policy. Those are the contours that make the interpretation feel coherent to some listeners. The description of a decisive hinge year, the presence of natural and political upheaval, and the rise of a leader who is both beloved and reviled. But even as these parallels feel compelling, the investigator must hold opposing pressures in tension. The methods by which Cayce's readings were recorded, trance sessions, transcribers' notes, reconstruction by assistants, introduce uncertainties. Over decades, second-hand transcriptions, private letters, and later retellings accumulate like layers of gloss on an original text. The so-called forbidden letters occupy a grey zone. Some may be genuine correspondence that Cayce's circle considered sensitive. Others could be later fabrications or misunderstandings. Archivists and scholars caution that variant spellings of Cayce's own name and inconsistencies in dating can lead to false precision. When a document's pedigree is uncertain, pinning national destiny to it becomes a hazardous act. There is another hazard as well. Prophetic language is rarely literal in the way modern news feeds are. Prophecy works in metaphor, pattern, and moral imagination. It is a kind of language that compels interpretation precisely because it does not provide the same kind of descriptive specificity we expect from a technical forecast. To say that Cayce predicted a particular politician risks a category error. It conflates the symbolic registers of seer speech with the forensic registers of historical naming. This is why most careful readers insist on translating Cayce's phrases into cautionary themes rather than press releases. The promise implicit in those readings that humanity can respond, that character and community matter in the face of catastrophe, is the ethical core, not the newsroom trivia. Still, for many, the convergence of imagery, timing, and recent events is impossible to ignore. They look at a list of contemporary signals and see the kindling for a larger narrative. There is the magnetic pole's drift. There are scientists who publish models warning of consequences if changes accelerate. There are the data points of stronger storms and expanding wildfire seasons, the maps that show coastlines vulnerable to rising seas. There are geopolitical frictions that do not always take the form of hot war, but of cyber attacks, supply chain disruption, and economic coercion between powerful states. There is the domestic fracture, a polity where mutual confidence has frayed, and institutions are tested by partisan fights. When woven together, these elements craft the motif Cayce offered, an age of pressure that produces both destruction and the possibility of spiritual renewal. Interpretive commentators then create a causal chain. Cayce's hinge year language suggests a time of testing. Testing increases the stakes of leadership. Leadership that arises in such a time will be decisive in shaping whether a society moves toward renewal or further fracture. If you accept that chain, then any charismatic and polarizing leader in that time frame becomes an object of intense scrutiny, not merely for policy, but for spiritual consequence. At this juncture, it is useful to examine why Donald Trump in particular becomes the focal point for many who read Cayce's words through a 21st century lens. It is not about the name alone. It is about a set of public behaviors and narratives that resonate with Cayce's portrait. Trump's political persona is built on rhetoric of restoration, the promise to make a nation great again, even as that rhetoric is often accompanied by attacks on institutions, derogatory language toward opponents, and an appeal to identity politics. His communication style amplifies division by design. Polarizing statements command attention and consolidate a base that sees him as a bulwark against cultural enemies. For interpreters, here is a leader who both claims to unify and whose methods institutionalize division. Timing matters too. Many Cayce commentators emphasize a window that stretches into the mid-2020s. Modern observers see in Trump's continued prominence the cycles of election and influence, the persistent public platform, the ability to shape media and political conversations, a performance of the kind of leadership Cayce described, persistent, formative, and potentially decisive at a pivotal moment. Those parallels are not airtight proofs. They are contextual overlays, an ancient textual image placed over a moving contemporary portrait to see what lines up. We must also consider the psychological and sociological mechanics of prophetic interpretation. When a culture faces rapid change, doubt and fear intensify the hunger for narratives that explain and locate meaning in disorder. Prophecy functions here as both alarm bell and map. It provides a story that says, this is not random, it has shape, and human choices matter. Thus, when Cayce's language is read in the light of current anxieties, it acquires an immediate utility. It focuses attention, assigns moral valence, and calls communities to act. That does not make the interpretation true in a factual sense. It does make it pragmatically powerful. And power, in modern politics, is its own phenomenon. A leader who commands power in a polarized context will inevitably be cast in mythic terms by supporters and critics alike. For admirers, this leader is the necessary instrument of correction. For detractors, the embodiment of the problem. Cayce's descriptions, which are simultaneously religious and political in tone, fall neatly into that myth-making. Thus the interpretive claim, Cayce's prediction about 2026, points toward a leader like Trump, functions as part exegesis and part cultural commentary. It reflects not only textual reading but also the interpreter's own horizon of fear and hope. At the same time, there are scientists, historians, and theologians who urge restraint. Geophysical changes are real. They have explanations rooted in physics and climate science. The magnetic poles movement has causes within Earth's inner dynamics and is studied using robust methods, but no scientist ties that drift to moral judgment or prophetic timetable. Climate change is a challenge driven by greenhouse emissions and feedback loops. Its intersections with prophecy are matters of interpretation rather than of scientific causation. Politically, leaders are products of institutions, structures, and popular movements. A single person, no matter how charismatic, cannot by themselves create the entire sweep of history. These counterpoints do not negate Cayce's images, they refract them through a different epistemic lens, one that separates metaphor from mechanism. Yet the interpretive bridge persists in popular conversation because of one stubborn fact. People experience meaning emotionally before they process it intellectually. A vivid image from a century-old seer, a shifting pole, a shaking coast, a leader who beckons while dividing, can resonate with a modern listener who just lost a home to fire, who reads alarming news about geopolitical brinkmanship, who watches political argument corrode neighborly trust. The logic is not purely rational, it is pastoral. It asks, in essence, what are we called to become if the world tightens around us? This question returns us to what may be the most important piece of Cayce's complex legacy. His reading rarely ends in doom. Even in passages that describe great convulsions, there is always an orientation toward healing and reconstruction. His prophetic voice, insofar as he can be said to have one, is corrective and invitational. The rhetorical shape is familiar to those who know biblical typologies. Warning is paired with a call to repentance. Shaking is paired with the possibility of a purer rebuilding. That theological grammar, which Cayce in his way echoes, refuses fatalism. It suggests that forewarning is an opportunity for change rather than a script for despair. We arrive then at a necessary posture for anyone who studies these texts and their modern appropriations: curiosity tempered by caution, urgency matched with a commitment to ethical interpretation. If you accept the title's bold claim at face value that Edgar Cayce predicted something about Trump for 2026 that is unfolding now, you must also accept the labor of proof, tracing textual provenance, separating verified readings from contested documents, and being explicit about interpretive moves. For those who reject the claim outright, there is still value in attending to the moral summons implicit in the language. Communities are being tested, leaders matter, natural systems are changing, how we respond will shape the future. If this line of inquiry resonates with you, and you want us to keep following the documents, the scientific studies, and the contested letters that sit at the margins of Cayce's archive, like and subscribe and stay with the investigation. The next segment will look closely at the documents themselves, which readings are well attested, which letters are disputed, and what the archival record actually supports. It will examine in forensic detail the most commonly cited passages about the mid-2020s and weigh them against the contested, forbidden letters people use to fill in missing edges. Before moving on, however, there are two more threads we must begin to weave through the story. Threads that will shape how the rest of this investigation proceeds. The first is methodological. How do we read prophecy across a century? The second is pastoral. What do people of faith do when prophecy seems to brush against public life and political personalities? Reading prophecy across time requires humility about categories. Prophetic language is rarely a manual of events. It is metaphorical, liturgical, and moral. Translating it into contemporary political terms demands choices. Which images do we literalize? Which do we treat as allegory? And which do we treat as a call to ethical action? Those hermeneutical choices are not neutral. They reflect the interpreter's own anxieties, hopes, and cultural assumptions. When an interpreter chooses to map Cayce's leader onto a modern politician, they are not simply reporting, they are theorizing. The strength of that theory depends on method, careful citation, attention to archive, and transparent admission of the imaginary steps taken between the text and the claim. The pastoral dimension is more immediate. For communities of faith who take Cayce seriously, the practical questions are urgent and concrete. How should we pray? How should we serve? How should we protect the vulnerable? How should we speak truth to power without becoming captive to partisan demonization? Cayce himself, in many of his readings, emphasized spiritual practice, works of mercy, communal care, inner transformation. If his warnings are to mean anything for believers, they should translate into action that strengthens the neighbor rather than fueling panic. That is a difficult discipline in an era when social media rewards simple moral binaries and encourages people to take their prophetic certainties into the public square without the patience to weigh evidence. These two threads, methodological caution and pastoral responsibility, will be critical as we turn to the contested documents that people claim contain more explicit references, and as we map the specific parallels commentators make between Cayce's hinge year language and a modern leader. It is in the intersection of these concerns that the story grows tense. The archive is messy, the world is unstable, and the temptation to transform a symbolic oracle into a contemporary scapegoat is strong. In the next phase of this investigation, we will examine specific passages often cited as evidence for a 2026 pivot, and we will scrutinize the provenance of the most sensational materials, the letters and transcripts that some call forbidden. We will also place those texts beside the scientific literature about magnetic pole movement and climate-related trends, always marking the difference between description and interpretation. Finally, we will analyze the interpretive moves that map Cayce's leader onto a living political figure, identifying where the parallels hold and where they fray. That work will not decisively close the question, but it should make clearer where conjecture ends and documented history begins. For now, hold this. The appeal of connecting a century-old voice to our present chaos is not merely about prophecy trivia. It is about moral orientation. Whether or not you accept the specific claim that Cayce predicted a leader who looks like Donald Trump, the underlying demand is the same: to examine how we live together, to repair what is breaking, and to prepare spiritually and practically for a season of testing. The question that stirs beneath the archival dust is not only did he say this, but if he did, what would we do differently? As we prepare to open the contested files and to measure textual claims against modern data, remember that both history and hope are at stake. History asks us to be exact, to account for sources and to name uncertainty. Hope asks us to act in love, to tend our communities, and to resist easy certainties that serve fear more than wisdom. The two are not enemies. They are companions on the long road ahead. What follows next is the careful work of putting contested pages beside modern data and of asking where imagination begins and documented record ends. We will walk through the most oft-cited passages that listeners point to as evidence for a hinge near 2026, examine why certain letters are treated as forbidden, and then lay out the limits of any argument that links a century-old seer to a living political actor. This is forensic reading with a pastoral aim: to understand what is probable, what is plausible, and what is primarily projection. Along the way, the investigation keeps returning to the same ethical question: how should people of faith respond when a prophetic tradition collides with headline politics? Begin with the archive itself. Among the thousands of items associated with Edgar Cayce, there is a core body of sessions that have been catalogued, dated, and debated within the mainstream scholarly and devotional communities. These readings are the ones most researchers rely on. They appear in official indexes, have been cross-checked with attendant notes, and form the backbone of Cayce's reputation as a healer and seer. Outside that core, however, sit documents of murkier provenance, typewritten copies with uncertain dates, hand-scrawled notes passed through private collections, and references in later letters that claim to remember conversations. Over the decades, some writers have gathered such marginalia and assembled a narrative that fills in the gaps left by the formally archived readings. Those supplemental materials are what people often mean when they speak of forbidden letters. The appeal of these disputed papers is obvious. They seem to provide sharper images, clearer timetables, and more dramatic warnings than some of the more ambiguous public readings. Where the catalogued sessions offer broad patterns, shakings, shifts in coastline, moral tests, the controversial letters sometimes read as if they push dates, specify regions, or describe leadership dynamics with greater intensity. That is precisely why archivists urge caution. Document authentication is a laborious process. Provenance must be established, handwriting compared, contemporaneous witnesses identified, and chain of custody traced. When those steps are incomplete, the documents remain interpretive tinder rather than archival timber. Yet in an age of viral posts and short attention spans, interpretive tinder spreads quickly. Turning to the cited passages themselves, it is possible to sketch their shared features without inventing quotations. The passages most frequently invoked by contemporary commentators present three overlapping motifs. First is geological disturbance, language that paints a world of shifting poles, altered coastlines, and tremors that reshape familiar shores. Second is political reconfiguration, a picture of nations falling and rising, commercial and cultural centers migrating, and established powers losing their primacy. Third is moral disintegration, images of social fragmentation, leaders who perform unity while deepening schisms, and communities tested by the severity of their choices. Together, these motifs form the narrative that listeners map onto present realities. Putting those motifs next to scientific reports produces a mixed tableau. On the geomagnetic question, scientists indeed report that the North Magnetic Pole has wandered from the Canadian Arctic toward Siberia faster in recent decades than in earlier recorded centuries. Geophysicists study how the magnetic field changes over time and model potential impacts on navigation, satellites, and electrical systems. Their language is technical and probabilistic. Models suggest, uncertainty remains, implications for certain systems. This scientific discourse does not translate into prophetic pronouncement. It does, however, offer one real-world phenomenon that aligns in thematic shape with Cayce's references to poles and compasses. For interpreters, that thematic alignment feels significant. For methodologists, it remains an instance of metaphor touching a measurable fact. When it comes to climate and extreme weather, the record is more direct. Climate scientists affirm that human emissions have increased the frequency and intensity of certain extreme events. Heat waves have become hotter, heavy precipitation events more intense in many regions, and wildfire seasons longer in others. Those who read Cayce's Shakings ecologically find a modern corroboration in this work. Yet here too, the interpretive jump is large. Climate science explains mechanisms, feedback loops, and anthropogenic drivers. It does not make metaphysical claims about moral reckoning or prophetic timelines. To marry the two is to overlay a theological grammar onto an empirical data set. Seismology, similarly, offers a mixed contribution. Earthquakes happen for tectonic reasons. Their distribution in time and place obeys physical laws rather than prophetic scripts. Regions like Japan and California have long histories of seismic activity, and modern instrumentation simply makes those events more visible and measurable. That visibility, the dense reporting, the live-streamed crisis, contributes to a cultural sensation that we are living through exceptional times. Interpreters of Cayce read that sensation back into the old language of coasts changing, while geologists warn against over-reading normal tectonic variance as an apocalyptic crescendo. Next, the political layer. Commentators who draw the line from Cayce's leader to present figures point to a pattern of rising polarization, institutional strain, and leadership that gains power by channeling grievance. These are sociological facts about many modern democracies. They are also the exact conditions in which charismatic, divisive figures can expand their influence. It is not surprising that Cayce's portrait of a leader who promises unity but deepens division resonates when placed beside a political actor who built authority in an era of fractured media, polarized identity politics, and deep distrust of institutions. Yet every step in this mapping is interpretive. It requires collapsing centuries of rhetorical difference into contemporary terms, translating symbolic images into socio-political categories, and assuming a directional causality between natural events and human governance that history rarely sustains in singular ways. A prophetic motif that describes testing can be read as a moral summons without ever committing to a single human agent as its hinge. Conversely, a modern leader's rhetoric that promises national restoration can be noticed without presuming that a seer's words were literally describing that person. There is an additional hermeneutical caution worth underscoring. Prophetic language often operates in the idioms of typology and recurrence. Across sacred traditions, seers describe patterns that recur across ages: the city that falls and rises, the leader who divides judgment from mercy, the sudden convulsion that clarifies hidden loyalties. Those patterns are not designed to be one-to-one maps to specific individuals. They are moral archetypes. In practice, that means that many leaders across history could meet the criteria of a prophetic archetype at different moments. That multiplicity should temper any single, definitive claim that a prophetic text meant this one contemporary person. So why does the specific case of Donald Trump become the focal point for so many contemporary readers? It is not because Cayce's archive contains a modern name. It is because the pattern fits in ways that feel salient to observers steeped in 21st century media and politics. Trump's public persona, the rhetoric of national restoration, the theatrical appeal, the relentless engagement with mass media platforms, and the tendency to frame institutional enemies as illegitimate, maps easily onto the archetypal figure described in prophetic motifs of performative unity. Timing amplifies the effect. A seer's talk of a mid-2020s pivot, read against an ongoing cycle of political contention, invites projection. This is not historical proof, it is a hermeneutical echo. For readers and listeners who gravitate toward prophetic frameworks, that echo matters, because prophecy is not primarily a historical instrument, it is a moral alarm. It asks communities to examine interior life and communal commitments when external jolt arrives. The question then is less whether Cayce literally meant a named politician, and more whether his moral warning about leaders and communal responsibility has practical force today. In other words, whether or not Cayce's language identifies a single individual, the ethical demands embedded in it, justice, mercy, honest civic engagement, care for the poor, remain pressing. That ethical demand brings us to the practical steps that the faithful can take amid these contested readings and unsettling headlines. Cayce's own counsel across many sessions emphasized spiritual practices that are refreshingly concrete: prayer, service, healing work, and communal repair. Translating that counsel into present action looks like a set of overlapping commitments. First, invest in relational resilience, strengthen neighborly ties, volunteer with local charities, support institutions that aid the vulnerable, and cultivate communities that practice generosity. Second, maintain intellectual honesty. Seek verified sources, distinguish primary documents from hearsay, and hold public claims up to scrutiny. Third, engage civically without succumbing to demonization. Defend just policies, speak truth to power, and refuse to treat political opponents as moral non-persons. Fourth, prepare practically. Resilience in the face of natural disruption means sensible emergency planning, care for elders and those with fewer resources, and participation in community-level preparedness efforts that do not rely on fatalistic expectation, but on prudent stewardship. These steps are not partisan prescriptions. They are the kinds of practices that, if widely adopted, reduce harm, regardless of who holds office or what natural shocks occur. They honor Cayce's dual emphasis on warning and rebuilding. They also guard against the worst effects of prophetic misappropriation, panicked withdrawal, scapegoating, or a fanatical focus on personality rather than structural justice. At the same time, the intellectual work of distinguishing provenance must continue. Researchers and interested citizens alike should press for clear archival standards when contested documents are cited as evidence. When a letter appears to specify dates or names, ask for its provenance. Who first recorded it? Can the handwriting be authenticated? Does it appear in contemporaneous correspondence? What do independent catalogues say about its origin? Such rigor does not diminish the spiritual seriousness of prophecy. It protects moral discourse from the distortions that arise when dubious documents are treated as unquestionable truth. There is also a theological humility embedded in this whole inquiry. The Bible itself contains voices that warn and comfort, that cry, beware, and then repair. The prophetic tradition, both in canonical forms and in the more modern manifestations like Cayce's, aims to form character as much as to predict chronology. When a community listens for signs, the most important question is seldom, who will it be? And more often, who shall we be? This question reorients attention from personality cults and political spectacle to the daily, often tedious work of mercy. For viewers wrestling with the title claim that prompted this investigation, the honest summary is plain. Edgar Cayce's corpus includes language that many interpret as pointing to a period of intensified testing around the mid-2020s. Some commentators and internet researchers read those materials, including a set of disputed letters, as indicating a decisive moment in which leadership choices will have outsized consequences. Others caution that the documents in question are of uncertain provenance and that Cayce's own public readings rarely, if ever, specify names or modern political markers. Scientific facts about magnetic pole drift, climate trends, and seismic activity are real and are rightly cause for concern. They are not, by themselves, proof that a particular prophetic reading is literally being fulfilled. Where Cayce's language and contemporary events overlap, what is most useful is not a rush to definitive labeling, but a sober engagement with moral responsibility. The closing posture of this investigation is not alarmist or indifferent. It is a summons to readiness anchored in hope. Cayce's tradition, even at its most cryptic, ends with an invitation to repent, to rebuild, and to forge communities that can sustain trials with compassion. That invitation can be embodied today in concrete acts, feeding neighbors, supporting honest journalism, participating in local governance, caring for creation, and developing resilience plans that protect the least advantaged. If this conversation has stirred something in you, a desire to know more, a need to act, or simply a hunger for discernment, share this message with someone who might benefit from the careful conversation, and consider subscribing so we can continue tracing archives, scientific reports, and contested material with both rigor and charity. The study of prophecy is as much a moral apprenticeship as it is an intellectual exercise. It asks us to steward truth responsibly and to embody hope practically. Lord, grant us wisdom to read ancient voices without haste, courage to act for our neighbors without rage, and the humility to hold our certainties lightly. Keep our feet steady on the threshold, our hands busy in service, and our hearts open to the work of repair. May grace accompany each choice you make in the days ahead.